Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we'll drift into the mysterious and molasses-slow origins of sugar, why it began as a secretive luxury, wrapped in leaves, locked in ledgers, whispered through ancient port cities, and how this sleepy little crystal quietly tiptoed its way into everything from royal feasts to your grandmother's jam jar. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Okay, let's begin. Long before sugar was something you stirred into your tea or shamelessly poured onto your cereal, it lived a quiet, leafy life inside tall green stalks that grew under the golden sun of Southeast Asia. These were sugarcane plants, thick, jointed grasses that swayed gently in the breeze, like they were just doing Tai Chi. And inside their fibrous bodies, sugar sparkled invisibly, snoozing away in liquid form, hidden from the world, like a valuable secret nobody had quite figured out how to unlock. Back then, around 8,000 years ago, people weren't exactly thinking dessert. They were busy discovering fire, inventing pans, and occasionally poking plants with sticks to see what happened. Somewhere in the warm, lush lands near what is now Papua New Guinea, someone took a bite from a chunk of sugarcane and blinked. Sweet. Not fruit sweet, not honeybee sweet. This was something else. A grassy, juicy, oddly celestial sweetness that didn't belong to berry or bee. Whoever that taster was, they probably didn't know they had just discovered humanity's future addiction, cavity culprit, and party guest of honor, all in one chew. At first, sugar wasn't exactly useful. You see, raw cane juice spoiled fast, and nobody had yet invented kettles, steam-powered mills, or dessert carts. So for centuries, sugar remained a kind of botanical novelty. People chewed the cane raw for a quick pick-me-up, like some prehistoric energy bar without the foil wrapper. It stayed local. It stayed humble. But plants have a habit of traveling. Or rather, humans have a habit of taking them places they never imagined going. Enter the early traders and sailors, those sunburned wanderers of the sea. Around 500 BCE, Persian and Indian texts began to mention something called sakara. That's Sanskrit for gravel, which, charmingly, was a reference to the unrefined, crumbly lumps of early cane sugar. Yes, the first sugar was referred to as fancy gravel. Try sprinkling that on toast. It was in India that sugar underwent its true glow-up. By around the 4th century CE, Indian chemists had figured out how to boil cane juice into a kind of solid, forming primitive sugar crystals. You might imagine this happening in a dreamy little alchemy lab behind a mango grove, with monks in linen robes carefully stirring bubbling vats by candlelight, and you wouldn't be far off. These early sugar boilers were revered like wizards. They turned liquid into gold, or at least into crunchy, sparkly rocks you could bribe a prince with. India, being India, was happy to share sweet things. Through trade, conquest, and the general spreading of ideas across ancient highways of curiosity, sugar made its way into Persia, across the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe, but not before taking its sweet, sweet time. By the time of Alexander the Great, in the late 4th century BCE, sugar was already being described as honey without bees, which, if you think about it, is kind of sad for the bees. All that buzzing and flower flirting, only to be replaced by a quiet stalk of grass. Now, here is where things start to get politely dramatic. Sugar didn't appear in Europe as a household item for a long, long time. For centuries, it remained a kind of sweet mystery, an Eastern spice, more valued than silver, hoarded by apothecaries, and sprinkled with great reverence into tonics for noble sore throats and royal grumpiness. A dash of sugar on a plate was like flashing a bar of gold across the dinner table. It said, "I'm so wealthy, I can make my food taste slightly better just because." Imagine being in 12th century England. You're in a cold stone room, trying to enjoy your turnip stew, and a bard starts singing about a faraway land where people drank tea with sugar. You'd think they were making it up. "Sweetness from grass," you'd say, while clutching your wooden spoon suspiciously. "Sounds like the devil's orchard." But sugar was coming, slowly, like a guest who takes their time at the cloakroom. Rolling in from the east, it caught a ride through trade routes, tucked itself into spice caravans, and slipped into the hands of monks, lords, and the occasional overly enthusiastic baker. And as the Middle Ages drifted toward a Renaissance glimmers of possibility, sugar was already whispering in the ears of empires. "Look at me," it said, invisibly seductive in its crystal cloak. "I can make your wealth sweeter, but we'll let the cane keep growing a little longer." In the next chapter, the sweetness gets political. The accidental sweet tooth of the Islamic Golden Age picture, the glimmering deserts of the Middle East around the 7th to 9th centuries. Instead of camels and tents, which, yes, were definitely there, let's focus on something much shinier. Brains. Big, beautiful, bookish brains. Because this was the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, a time when scholars were zipping around Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, translating everything from Aristotle to astrolabes, and debating whether the moon had tides or just low self-esteem. But amid the libraries and the lunar speculation was sugar. Now, to say sugar arrived dramatically would be an overstatement. Sugar didn't burst into town riding a golden elephant or demand a throne in the House of Sweets. No, sugar crept in, softly, faintly crystal by crystal, like a guest who was technically invited, but no one remembered sending the invitation. Sugarcane had been cultivated in India as far back as 500 BCE by industrious folks who discovered that boiling cane juice turned it into solid crystals, which were, conveniently, delicious. The Sanskrit word for sugar, shakara, even meant gravel, which is exactly what sugar looked like back then. Tasty little pebbles of edible joy. This sweet habit took its time migrating west. Traders brought it from India to Persia, where local sugar makers, never ones to turn down a fascinating way to boil things, began experimenting. Persian engineers, already masters of wind catchers, garden layouts, and inventing air conditioning several centuries too early, turned their minds to refining sugar. And oh, did they refine. Soon, cane fields began sprouting wherever irrigation could coax something green from the dust. Persia became not just a passageway for sugar, but a very enthusiastic fan club of it. Sugar was expensive, exotic, and used mainly by the wealthy, who, let's be honest, never missed a chance to sprinkle something on their lamb, just to show that they could. From Persia, sugar toddled west into the heart of the Islamic Empire, helped along by armies, traders, scholars, and the occasional really determined beekeeper who was tired of working with bees. And then came the Abbasids of Baghdad, scholars, theologians, scientists, and connoisseurs of both ancient Greek philosophy and deeply complicated desserts. This is the moment sugar stopped being a passing guest and started setting up permanent residence in the kitchens of the powerful. In Baghdad, oh sparkling, scroll-stuffed, stargazing Baghdad, sugar became science. Court cooks experimented like little edible alchemists. They wrote cookbooks, believe it or not, real cookbooks, with elaborate recipes combining sugar, rosewater, almonds, and cinnamon. Desserts with names that translated to things like the the soul's delight, the standing milk, and, oh no, I forgot to take this off the fire. One Abbasid-era cookbook lists 100 different sweetmeats. That's right, 100. Which is either a delightful tribute to culinary creativity or a sign that these people seriously needed hobbies that didn't involve rotating syrups around pine nuts. Sugar's rise during the Islamic Golden Age wasn't just about indulgence, though. In a rather endearing twist of logic, sugar was thought to be healthy. Doctors trained under Hippocratic and Galenic medicine believed sugar was cool and moist, like cucumbers, moonlight, and a particularly chill camel. It was prescribed for everything from upset stomachs to melancholy humours. Imagine visiting your medieval physician and, instead of leeches or something truly unfortunate involving boiling cloths, you got sherbet and candied violet petals. Honestly, take me back. Of course, the spread of sugar didn't happen in a vacuum. It followed the trade routes from the Silk Road, that ancient internet without cat videos, to the maritime routes across the Indian Ocean, where daring seafarers moved cloves, textiles, and knowledge through tides and monsoon winds. As sugar flirted its way westward, it also mingled with Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and eventually Latin texts. The word itself began to shapeshift. Shakara to the Persian shaka, the Arabic sukkar, and into medieval Latin as saccharum. So if you feel like calling your next cupcake a linguistic artifact, you officially have the historical license to do so. Every grain of sugar that twinkled in the candlelight of a caliph's banquet had a story, a trail of boiling pots and camel caravans and scribes who probably got distracted mid-transcription because they were secretly snacking on date rolls. So while Europe would still be gnawing on turnips and wondering whether bathing might be too decadent, the Islamic world had already transformed sugar into a substance of sophistication, science, and syrupy poetry. As we softly drift across time and space, let's follow sugar as it continues its quiet conquest, this time slipping into the sun-drenched lands of southern Europe, where monks, merchants, and monarchs would all develop. A bit of a sweet problem. Sweet stalks and early schemes. Before sugar was found in nearly every pantry, coffee cup, and carb-loaded cereal, it lived a relatively quiet life. It started as a humble, leafy grass swaying lazily in the warm breezes of Southeast Asia. Yes, sugarcane, the tall, leafy drama queen of the plant world, started out with no aspirations of global conquest. It was content to sit in the sun, soak up some tropical rain, and grow centimetre by patient centimetre, like someone slowly assembling a complicated IKEA bookshelf with no sense of urgency. Early humans discovered sugarcane sweetness not by extracting white sparkly crystals, but by chewing on its fibrous stalks, essentially the prehistoric equivalent of gnawing on a wet bamboo flute that hums with sugar. Imagine ancient farmers just walking barefoot through their fields, stopping now and then to take a thoughtful nibble of cane and say, "Ah yes, definitely not kale." Archaeological evidence, that elegant phrase meaning a bunch of pots and burnt things we dug up, tells us that sugarcane was being cultivated as far back as 8000 BCE in places like New Guinea. But it took centuries for someone to ask the important question: what if we just boiled this until it turns into crunchy treasure? Enter India. Around 500 CE, Indian scientists and sweet-toothed geniuses began refining the process of extracting sugar from cane juice. They called the resulting crystalline product shakara, which eventually became the word sugar, because pronunciation is a slippery fellow through centuries and spice routes. India, at this point, was not just being a polite neighbour, by keeping sugar to itself. No, sugar was exported, along with other legendary items like black pepper, philosophical debates, and the occasional war elephant, to surprise and intrigue surrounding empires. The Persians got a taste and called it reeds that produce honey without bees, a poetic description, although a bit misleading to dinner party guests hoping for a beehive centerpiece. Still, sugar remained a luxury, not the sort of thing you dump into your morning tea while stress scrolling through emails. No, sugar was for the elite. It was medicine, it was spice, it was art. Ancient Ayurvedic texts listed sugar as a cooling agent in the body, while doctors sometimes used it to mask the absolutely ghastly flavors of other treatments. Imagine being healed with a teaspoon of sugar blended gently into crushed snail gallstones and powdered fungus. A spoonful of sugar helps the horror go down. Soon enough, sugar ventured westward through the Silk Road, like a shy but determined backpacker with a sweet secret. The knowledge of crystallizing sugar traveled to the Middle East, where alchemists in Persia began refining the art with mathematical precision and a sense of theater. Arab traders spread this knowledge across their vast empire, and just like that, medieval sugar was the celebrity ingredient of royal kitchens from Baghdad to Cairo. It wasn't just food, it was sculpture. It was served in molded forms, castles, unicorns, pineapples, all painstakingly made of sugar paste and as delicious as they were completely inedible due to hardening like marble. There's something dreamily silly about all this, isn't there? Grown humans carving wild animals out of sugar just to impress each other at banquets while discussing astrology and inheritance taxes. Kings were known to eat sugar sculptures with a dagger, the way you or I might carve sad slices out of frozen lasagna with a butter knife at 2 a.m. By the time Europeans were truly paying attention, which, let's be honest, was often later than ideal, sugar had already made a name for itself in the world's cultural kitchen. Returning crusaders in the 11th and 12th centuries began whispering tales of this magical sweet crystal they had encountered in the East. "You wouldn't believe it," they muttered, eyes wide like time-traveling toddlers discovering sprinkles for the first time. "It's like salt, but kind." Soon, European apothecaries were selling sugar as both a medicine and a spice, placing it neatly on shelves next to ground unicorn horn and dried lizard skins. It was, briefly, considered good for the digestion, for melancholy, and, most importantly, for impressing the nobility at dinner. All this, and sugar still hadn't reached full conquest mode. At this stage, it was a rising star, a whispered rumor, an exotic curiosity, more myth than staple. But the world was changing. Venice was about to get sticky, trade winds were shifting, and a few rather pushy nations were deciding it was high time to remake the world in the image of dessert. Let's drift now, like a forgotten honey spoon in lukewarm tea, toward the warm waters of the Mediterranean, where sugar's story is only just beginning to caramelize. The whisper of windmills and sugar dreams. Now let us drift ever so lightly across the quiet fields of 12th century Sicily, where the hum of windmills began whispering a new kind of sweetness into the air. Picture it. Olive-skinned farmers tucking their cloaks against the breeze, orange groves blooming with floral delight, and in the distance, the slow creak of wooden gears as giant sails turned lazily, transforming wind into power and cane into crystals. Before sugar became a staple of the human diet, or, as it would soon become, a mildly addictive life accessory, it was considered rather exotic, a rare splurge, a party favor fit for sultans and serenely self-important European nobles who sampled it in much the same way modern hipsters approach truffle oil. In those early centuries, the Mediterranean was a sleepy stomach waiting to be stirred. And Sicily, nestled in the navel of maritime trade, was just the place for such a sweet awakening. The island had been colonized, traded over, invaded, recaptured, and generally bossed around by every empire with a boat and a flag. The Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, and that one guy named Roger, who apparently became king of it all. Yes, King Roger II of Sicily, possibly the most statistically unremarkable ruler with the most delightful name. Roger is not a name that demands awe. It's a name you give to a tired blacksmith who just wants his sandwich. But King Roger, in all his roguish Rogerness, inherited a melting pot of cultures and culinary quirks. The Arabs, who ruled the island before him, had already introduced sugarcane and even built early refineries to boil down its precious juice and fuss over it like Victorian aunties over a marmalade pot. By the 12th century, sugar was growing out in the open fields south of Palermo, a landscape that quite possibly smelled of orange blossom and freshly steeped molasses. Arab engineers had brought irrigation techniques finer than a bishop's robes, and what needed watering more than an endlessly thirsty tropical grass like sugarcane? The world's first real commercial sugar plantations flourished here, though by modern standards, they were more like experimental gardens tended by philosophers in sandals. Still, the idea was taking root. Sugar wasn't just medicine anymore. It was a possibility. Windmills, low-tech marvels with sails like sleepy sunflowers, began to grind juice-laden stalks with a sighing rhythm. They didn't rush. No one in medieval Sicily was in a hurry. You and I would find the pace admirable, possibly contagious. The juice was boiled into syrup, then coaxed ever so slowly into crystallization, forming lumpy, sticky cones of sweetness, humble yet thrilling in their novelty. These, sugarloaves, as they were called, were shaped like the party hats of sensible monks. To eat one required a hammer and a certain disregard for dental safety. Still, people fell in love. Sugar soon started appearing in recipes like chicken with raisins and cinnamon. It was less dessert and more culinary dare. Bakers used it sparingly, poets raved about it unhelpfully, and merchants haggled over it like it was 1 part treasure, 1 part talisman. And let us not forget, sugar was still very much seen through the foggy lens of medieval medicine. Doctors, armed with roughly 3 actual facts and 1,000 conflicting hunches, considered sugar useful for everything from treating coughs to balancing imaginary humours. If your spleen was being moody, or if your phlegm had an attitude, sugar might be just the ticket. And if you happened to enjoy it, well, that was a happy accident. Back in Sicily's quiet mills, the wind carried on, patient and unconcerned, turning gears that pressed sweetness from tall, grassy green stalks. Workers sipped coffee from bowls, talked philosophically about whether figs had moods, and probably didn't realize they were midwifing a new global obsession. But sugar had learned something here, in this sunlit corner of the world. It had discovered how to be produced at modest scale, tended toward with care, and infused into culture 1 sticky spoon at a time. It was just beginning its long game. Sleepily, it was spreading. Next, let's follow sugar as it tiptoes out of the Mediterranean and into the appetites of Europe, through gilded banquet halls, monastic kitchens, and some very confused German apothecaries. Sugar and the velvet chains of colonial tea time. By the time sugar shimmied its way into European drawing rooms and dainty teacups, it had already begun whispering sweet dreams, and not entirely the innocent kind. This was an age where porcelain was precious, digestion was a daily ordeal, and tea was as much a social performance as a beverage. Welcome to the 17th and 18th centuries, when sipping tea wasn't just hydrating, it was a declaration of being terribly refined, while quietly participating in an enormous global syndrome of sticky entanglements. Let's set the scene, shall we? Imagine a salon in Georgian England. Heavy drapery, uncomfortable wigs, and people named things like Horace and Wilhelmina, engaging in passionate debates about how firmly one should stir their tea. The beverage of choice, imported, exotic, expensive, was tea from China, and one couldn't possibly endure its slight bitterness unaided. Enter sugar, bright, powdery, intoxicatingly sweet sugar. It was the social lubricant of an era that forbade emotion, but encouraged small spoons of delight. The British elite began adding sugar to tea as naturally as they powdered their faces, heavily and without much thought for the consequences. With each conspicuously gentle clink of a silver spoon inside a porcelain cup, sugar was weaving a silk-soft net around not just mouths, but empires. You see, by now sugar was no longer some rare apothecary's powder or overpriced medieval spice kept in a locked box next to the family jewels. In the Caribbean, sugarcane plantations had mushroomed with eerie speed and industrial precision. Islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, before someone in the French court renamed it Haiti, never imagining the plot twist that awaited, throbbed with the relentless rhythm of sugarcane work. Sunrise to sunset, sweat glistening on brows that would never know the pleasure of a sugar cube melting in warm tea. This is where things grow both complicated and very sticky indeed. The triangular trade isn't, as it might sound, a particularly avant-garde coffee order, but rather a three-cornered whirlpool of commerce connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas, like the world's most regrettable group chat. Ships from Europe sailed to the western coast of Africa, carrying weapons, textiles, and rum. Traded for enslaved humans who were then torn from their homelands and forced across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. A voyage so unfathomably cruel that oceans grew heavy with horror. These enslaved people arrived in the Americas, where they were sold into labor on sugar plantations. Meanwhile, the raw sugar produced by their suffering was shipped back to Europe, where it landed in those aforementioned teacups, daintily stirred and thoroughly enjoyed by people who rarely paused to consider where their sweetness came from. So yes, sugar did take over Europe, but it did so on ships lined with blood. What's most curious is how quietly this happened. Sugar didn't declare war. It didn't conquer the old-fashioned way with cannons or crossbows. No, sugar conquered by invitation, offered on silver trays, folded seamlessly into custards, cakes, and cups of hot tea. It was the charming guest that never left, gradually becoming so integrated into daily life that no one remembered a time before it. A spoonful here, a crumble there. Before long, even the poorest in Britain were saving what little they had just to sweeten their tea, and imagine, for a moment, that they too were part of the social masquerade. But we must not be too hard on those people of the past. They loved their sweetness, much as we love ours now. The sugar habit was never just about taste. It was about ritual, identity, and the illusion of control over life's bitter flavors. You sip, you stir, you control the sweetness. What a powerful, sugar-dusted delusion. By the end of the 18th century, sugar consumption in Britain had skyrocketed. What had been a luxury was now almost a right. Toothaches were rising, but so too were empires. In school books, sugar rarely received a chapter, but if you look closely, You could see its fingerprints on the margins, financing wars, upsetting economies, crossing oceans with a smug granularity. And still, the drawing rooms glowed with candlelight as teaspoons clinked and biscuits were dunked. It all felt so terribly civilized. But beyond the wallpapered parlors, the sweetness had a cost. As our eyelids grow heavier, and isn't that fitting given all this sugar talk, let us drift gently toward a whisper from the east, where another sweet revolution was quietly stirring in the shadows of steam and silk. Something fermented, something ancient, something distinctly caffeinated. Yes, but let's steep in that mystery. Next time, the golden crystals that became a currency. Let's drift now to a peculiar moment in history when sugar, the sweet, sticky daydream of every dessert, was no longer just a rare treat or pharmacy curiosity. It was starting to become something far more powerful. A currency. Not in the literal clinky-clanky sense of coinage, but in the way it altered the value of land, the direction of empires, and the length of dinner invitations. To explain this quietly astonishing transformation, we must waft ourselves back to the 15th and 16th centuries, when European boats were beginning to pop up in places they weren't exactly invited. These great wooden sailing ships, decked out in scruffy sailors and questionable chart-reading skills, were piloted partly by curiosity, partly by rumors of spices, and, let's be honest, a lot by the craving for profit. And sugar, dear dreamer, was becoming profitable indeed. At this time, the precious golden crystals were still something of a gourmet luxury in Europe. They didn't show up in normal households. Sugar was closer to a spice than a staple, sprinkled lightly onto meats or preserved fruits, like a farewell kiss from a very rich aunt. In fact, in royal kitchens, sugared dishes were paraded about more for show than savor, often shaped into castles, swans, and unfortunately hard-to-chew battle scenes. But something was bubbling up, figuratively and quite literally, in large cauldrons, on the islands of the Atlantic. It began on Madeira and the Canary Islands, where Portugal and Spain started planting and boiling sugarcane with alarming enthusiasm. The islands were warm, wet, and tropical, not ideal for wool sweaters, but lovely for growing cane. The cane thrived, and so, like anyone who discovers that their garden grows very profitable plants, they expanded, dramatically. It didn't take long before cartographers were adding tiny island notations like excellent for sugar, terrible for naps. And European powers began treating any tropical island with the same calculating expression a cat has before knocking a vase off a table. Enter the Portuguese in Brazil. In the early 1500s, they landed on Brazil's humid shores, took one long breath of the sweet-smelling trade winds, and said, "Yes, this will do." Within a few decades, Brazil was producing sugar on a scale that made European aristocrats weep with joy, and dentists weep in anticipation. Oh, but there was, of course, a heavy cost, a heartbreak woven into every spoonful. To produce sugar at such a scale required immense labor, not the romantic sort of labor, like painting ceilings while humming madrigals, but constant, back-breaking, life-shortening labor. And so, the horrible chapter of transatlantic slavery was pulled into motion. Millions of people from Africa were forcibly transported to work the sugar plantations, treated as commodities in a system whose sweetness was etched with suffering. Sugar didn't just become valuable. It became so wildly lucrative, so dangerously desired, that entire economies began to orbit around it, like tired bees stuck in a perpetual molasses spiral. In the Caribbean, islands changed hands between European powers like trading cards, The Dutch would swap a coal colony like New Amsterdam, now known as New York, for a hot little sugar island. And if that seems absurd, well, that's because it was. But sugar was thought to be worth more than land or snow or reason itself. Even pirates, yes, those slippery, rum-guzzling romantic rogues of history, weren't just after doubloons and shiny trinkets. No, many pirates of the Caribbean were happily plundering ships full of sugar. Because if you hijacked a boat full of sugar barrels, you could resell it for a fortune or at least throw a terrific bake sale. So there it was, sugar becoming a form of wealth, not quite minted but potent all the same, measured not in ounces of gold, but in pounds of cane. Royal treasuries started issuing loans to planters. Banks backed sugar fortunes. Wars were whispered over plantations and whispered a little louder over molasses monopolies. And the most surreal part, amid all of this, wars smouldering, pirates swaggering, and empires growing toothaches, people still thought of sugar mostly as a treat, a tickle on the tongue, a sign of celebration. A wedding cake hides an empire if you know where to look. As our minds begin to melt like sugar in warm tea, picture this: a French noble nibbling on a candied violet while plantation ships loaded with brown barrels slip into port beneath stormy Atlantic skies. The sugar has arrived, and with it, destiny. Slip deeper now, as we follow sugar's sticky trail from fortunes to revolutions, where confections would soon stir rebellion. The sweet architects of empire. If sugar ever had a golden age of global meddling, and let's be honest, it did, it began when empires started looking at molasses and thinking, that could fund a navy. Tonight we sail gently, ever so gently, into the powdered heart of the 17th century, when colonial powers, fueled by both greed and an inexplicable fondness for treacle, began to mold the world in the shape of a sugar cube. It all started with empty mugs and full ambitions. European powers had just discovered tea, coffee, and chocolate within a suspiciously short span of time, likely the busiest caffeine-fueled week in beverage history. Suddenly, the bitter drinks of status and ceremony needed a softening partner, a snowy savior of flavor, and sugar, ever the charming codependent, was ready to oblige. But sugar wasn't homegrown to the thirsty monarchs and merchant classes of Europe. Oh no, this sweet stuff was tropical by nature, preferring the humid flirtation of the Caribbean, Brazil, and parts of Southeast Asia. And so, the race began, not for the sugar itself, but for the dirt it grew in. Britain, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain began scooping up sugar islands like they were rocks in a competitive game of colonial hopscotch. These tiny plots of land, Barbados, Saint-Domingue, Jamaica, became immensely valuable. Some were only a few dozen square miles across, but churned out more wealth annually than entire continents. Because, dear listener, in the shadowy balance books of empire, refined sugar soon outweighed gold. Enter plantation economics, that dreary-hearted system in which enormous land holdings were worked not by machines, because machines often require ethics, but by enslaved labor. It's not a fun bedtime thought, but it is a necessary one, tenderly included, so that the sweetness of history isn't honeyed with forgetfulness. Barbados, the first major British sugar colony, became eerily efficient. By the late 1600s, it looked less like a tropical paradise and more like an outdoor sugar processing factory with palm trees. Roofs sagged under the weight of molasses barrels. Horses grew ever more suspicious of being asked to power rollers used to crush cane stalks. Entire ships were built just to carry molasses back to Europe, where enterprising distillers turned it into rum. a move that subsequently made seafaring simultaneously more profitable and significantly more inebriated. And behind the logistical ballet of sweet shipping stood powerful men in powdered wigs. The British Parliament was unusually interested in sugar, mostly because wealthy plantation owners tended to buy seats in it. There were even detailed sugar duties passed, like the Molasses Act of 1733, which was essentially the government saying, perhaps we can make even more money from all this sticky madness. But one of the most curious footnotes in this syrupy crescendo was the rise of the sugar barons, a term which sounds like a delightful brand of breakfast cereal, but was, in reality, a very serious and wealthy class of individuals. These were the owners of vast cane fields and human labour forces, men who lived absurdly lavish lives in both colonial outposts and townhouse terraces in London. They mixed sugar with extravagance until their very decor whispered of saccharine dominance. Chandeliers, mahogany everything, and tea served 5 times a day, each cup sweetened with the work of 1,000 weary hands. And then there was France, which threw its considerable cultural weight behind sugar production in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. At its peak in the 18th century, the colony produced nearly half the world's sugar. How did a sliver of land do so much heavy lifting? Through the darkest mechanisms history has to offer. Saint-Domingue was at once the richest colony on earth and the stage for the greatest uprising against enslavement the world had ever seen. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just know that sugar had turned Europe's empires into decadent, drowsy addicts. By the late 1700s, Europeans were consuming sugar not just in tea, but in everything imaginable. Pastries, medicines, even roasted meats. The line between sustenance and dessert blurred quietly. Doctors prescribed molasses for melancholy. Not entirely a terrible idea, depending on dosage and mood. And so, sugar became architecture, the scaffolding of empire, the blueprint of colonial economies, and the foundation of a sweet, if ethically sticky, legacy. As we gently tug the sails and drift into calmer night waters, next we'll explore how beet sugar, yes, the humble root vegetable, tried to overthrow its tropical cousin and redefine sweetness in a chilly German laboratory. The crumpled map and the caffeinated navigator. Somewhere in the late 15th century, when the world still believed dragons lived just off the coast of Portugal, and maps looked more like art school group projects than instruments of navigation, something quietly shifted. Sugar had already begun its slow stroll across medieval markets and noble tables. But now, a haphazardly drawn map, a few energetic explorers, and a growing appetite for both profits and pastries were about to change. Well, everything. This wasn't an official plan, of course. Empire, like a lot of things, often begins with someone trying to top their neighbor's dessert tray. Let's start in a place that rhymes with genocide and linen grants. Ah yes, Venetians and cinnamon plants. Close enough. Europe, that fanciful continent of curious hats and uncompensated overconfidence, had been importing sugar as a luxury from Arab and Indian traders for centuries. It was a high-class accessory, like jeweled shoe buckles or pet monkeys who could hiccup in Italian. But it wasn't just sugar that sweetened the merchant's purse. It was also the promise of the East, those spice-laden lands glimmering in the pages of second-hand travelogues and whispered tales about kingdoms where pepper grew like moss and no one had ever heard of winter. And so, onto the scene stumbled a set of well-dressed, sleep-deprived European explorers. Portugal and Spain, two nations with more wind in their sails than good decisions, each began looking for a shortcut to Asia. They weren't just craving cloves, they wanted sugarcane. Lots of it, with land and labor. You know, in the way that rich people always want things, with complicated consequences. Now, one might pause here and ask, what does this have to do with sugar quietly taking over the world? Excellent question, imaginary listener. You see, as these European powers began poking at coastlines like anxious toddlers at a garden slug, they brought sugarcane with them, little by little. A stalk here, a plantation there. Islands were tested like sour grapes. Take the Canary Islands, for example. A lovely volcanic archipelago where Europe first tested its theory that empire tastes better with a few tablespoons of cruelty. Sugarcane was planted there in the early 15th century. The results? Sticky fingers, coin clinking in purses, and a precedent set for what would soon stretch across oceans. Sugar as an empire-making plant. Christopher Columbus, yes, that one. The Genoese sailor, whose navigational instincts might best be described as confidently incorrect, had sailed not just with dreams of spices, but with sugarcane cuttings nestled alongside rosaries and attitude. On his second voyage in 1493, because the first one was unexpectedly still highly rated, he brought sugarcane to the Caribbean. He planted it like a flag, for queen, for country, and perhaps unknowingly, for cupcakes yet unborn. The islands turned out to be nearly perfect for growing sugarcane. Warm climate, reliable rainfall, and ample supplies of cheap or enslaved labor. Ideal conditions for what we might today call an economic horror smoothie with agricultural garnish. European powers, seeing success in these tropical labs, began replicating it shamelessly and violently. Plantations bloomed in Brazil, in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Trinidad. Sugar enslaved not only taste buds but entire populations. Quietly, sugar's empire swelled, not through battles and declarations but through cravings, trade, and the murmur of coins cascading into chests. The sweetness was a mask. Beneath it, the bitter mechanics of empire chugged on. And so, the crumpled map, scribbled haphazardly, guided not just sailors toward new shores, but sugar toward dominance. The navigator, jittery from too much coffee and too little sleep, unknowingly charted more than routes. He paved a sticky trail across continents and centuries. But now, having narrowly avoided several sea serpents, outsailed common sense, and deposited sugarcane like it was a particularly pushy postcard, European explorers left the world subtly changed, not with the boom of cannons, but with a softness, the hush of cane leaves in a tropical breeze, and the quiet clink of molasses being barreled on moonlit shores. And as the stars drift above the quiet Atlantic, we turn gently toward the next chapter, where merchants, monarchs, and molasses begin to stir the pot even more. The Great British Sugar Rush. As fog rolled gently through the cobbled streets of 17th century London, a curious scent began to take hold. A scent warm, welcoming, and just a bit too enthusiastic about molasses. It was the smell of revolution, not the noisy political kind with pitchforks and powdered wigs, but a much quieter upheaval, one best served piping hot, with 2 lumps and perhaps a questionable biscuit. Yes, sugar had arrived in Britain, and frankly, it was about to conquer. Unlike the ancient elites of Persia or the sweet-toothed palaces of the Mughals, the Brits were late to the sugar party. So late, in fact, they'd practically missed the canapes. But once they discovered it, oh dear listener, it was as though someone had given Queen Elizabeth's soggy empire a spoonful of mischief. At first, sugar was an aristocratic novelty, gleaming white, headache-inducingly expensive, and sold in loaf forms so rock solid they could double as burglar deterrents. People showed them off like trophies. Having a sugar loaf in your home was equal parts dessert and domestic flex. British nobles would carve it in front of guests like it was a roast goose, or worse, an heir. But the powdered temptation did eventually trickle its way down the social staircase. As Caribbean plantations expanded under grim colonial conditions, and enslaved labor powered sugar production at terrifying efficiency, prices dropped just enough for the middle classes to taste the sparkle. And once they did, oof, game over. The British people fell into sugar with the unblinking commitment of a Victorian child in a jelly shop. They stirred it into tea, baked it into puddings, and even started making something the French found utterly scandalous: jam. Now, let's dreamily drift into one of the quieter revolutions in British history: tea time. Before sugar, tea was a rather bitter herbal brew, mostly tolerated because it didn't give you the plague. But add sugar, and suddenly it was a warm, relaxing spa session for your tongue. Sip by sweetened sip, tea with sugar became a national ritual, one so sacred it could survive war, fog, and dampness that went down to your very bones. The British East India Company began importing the stuff in ungodly volumes. Crates of sugar flowed like sticky rivers into London docks, handled by stevedores who dreamt of molasses in their sleep. And if the sugar hadn't already seeped into every cupboard from Cornwall to Inverness, along came another sugary century in the ranks: the humble biscuit. You see, where tea and sugar went, biscuits soon followed like loyal Labradors. These sweet, crunchy companions became little edible sponges for your hot beverage. Dunkability became a national concern. Biscuits were designed for tensile strength, able to bear the burden of damp tea without collapsing into tragic mush. It was a biscuit's ability to cling to dignity in the face of scalding liquid that made it truly British. But there's a deeper secret breaching the between-meals snack attack. Sugar wasn't just fueling afternoon indulgence. It was, quietly, transforming diets, economies, even politics. In many ways, sugar was the invisible thread stitching together the British Empire. From tropical plantations to Liverpool sugar refineries, from the porcelain cups of Mayfair to the tins of treacle at the corner shop, Liverpool became a crimson-stained rum and sugar kind of town, its docks pumping with raw cane offloaded by men cursing the gooey barrels and slipping in every third sentence. If you'd wandered into a British kitchen by the mid-1700s, which we hope you do in your dreams, for it's a very calming sort of place, you might have found a peculiar device known as a sugar nipper. These contraptions resembled small guillotines, used to hack chunks off sugar loaves. There is something gently surreal about someone casually pulling out a domestic beheading device to sweeten their scone. And while historians debate whether Britain industrialized because of steam engines or surplus elbow grease, some whisper that the relentless, buzzing energy behind textile mills and factory towns had another source. Little boys hopped up on treacle tart and syrup sponge. Maybe, just maybe, the real fuel of empire wasn't coal, it was cake. Whatever the cause, the sugar train was chugging across the nation, leaving crumb trails and cavities as far as the highlands. Doctors began to tut. Moralists began to scold. And still, candied oranges remained a socially acceptable breakfast. Now, as we sugar gliders float toward the next dreamy chapter, we'll see how sugar's sweet siren song made its way into politics, revolutions, and an awful lot of toothaches, all while quietly sticking to the curtains of history like a forgotten boiled sweet. Napoleon's sticky little problem. Imagine, if you will, an emperor in a dazzling hat, 1,000 buttons on his uniform, and not one but two hands. One famously tucked into his waistcoat, the other probably reaching stealthily for a candied plum. Yes, as Europe smouldered in the fires of revolution and empire, sugar found itself once again inexplicably entangled in global politics, because everything, given enough time, somehow comes down to either tariffs, tea, or toffee. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, sugar was no longer the glittering luxury of kings alone. Middle-class teacups were being cluttered with sugar cubes. Children with suspiciously sticky fingers increasingly blamed the family parlor clock for their dessert crimes. And across the Channel, Napoleon Bonaparte, so famously short on patience but abundant in ambition, found himself caught in a ruby-sweet conundrum. You see, Britain, France's eternal frenemy, ruled the waves and, rather irritatingly, the sugar trade. The British Navy, with its sails puffed like powdered wigs, kept a tight grip on colonial shipping routes. Sugar, largely sourced in the West Indies, flowed freely to British markets, sweetening their tea and their coffers in roughly equal measure. But not for France. Oh no. Napoleon, who could conquer half of Europe but couldn't get a decent spoonful of sugar in his coffee, found this all a little offensive. In 1806, he issued a decree, the Berlin Decree, which had nothing to do with travel guides and everything to do with cutting off all British trade to the continent. This continental system was meant to choke British commerce, but also had the inconvenient side effect of leaving Parisian pâtissiers staring into their mixing bowls with existential dread. No sugar meant no meringue, and no meringue, no morale. So naturally, enter stage left, the sugar beet. Beets, those humble, earthy little root vegetables best known for staining fingers and causing minor disputes at dinner tables, were, at this point, not exactly a cause for excitement. But in 1747, a Prussian chemist named Andreas Marggraf had discovered that beets, like their more bronzed cousin, sugarcane, held sucrose in their secret vegetal hearts. His pupil, Franz Achard, took it a step further and built an actual sugar extraction operation in Silesia. It was, in essence, a scientific attempt to wring sweetness from something that tastes, by most accounts, like 19th century despair. Napoleon, always alert to a shortcut to greatness, or at least cake, seized on the idea. He poured resources into sugar beet research and production, offering prizes for the best cultivation and encouraging farmers to tear up their fields of wheat or wine and plant the beet instead. Schools were opened to teach the lofty art of beet sugaring. Factories puffed and steamed across the countryside. Children collected beets instead of marbles. It was a national mission, not quite on par with the pyramids, but close. And astonishingly, it worked. By 1812, over 300 beet sugar factories ran across Napoleonic Europe. France, through sheer force of will and root vegetable engineering, had created its own independent sugar economy. But, as with most things involving Bonaparte, the sweet success was somewhat short-lived. When Napoleon eventually took his extended holiday on the Isle of Elba, and Europe delighted in dividing up the map like an overcooked lasagna, the British moved right back in with their vast naval reach and cheaper sugarcane imports. Beet sugar became less economically viable overnight. The fields started reverting back to more savory crops, and the beet was, once again, just a beet. Still, seeds had been planted, both literal and economic. The notion of producing sugar domestically through beets stuck. When the world would later descend into more wars and interruptions of trade, sugar beets would rise again as the dependable understudy whenever sugarcane missed its cue. But there's something rather delightful in picturing Napoleon, fierce and famously feisty, standing in a greenhouse garden, tapping his boot as botanists fussed over soil acidity and beet yield ratios. It's a reminder that history, even when embroidered with gold epaulets and destiny of empire speeches, sometimes hinges on the humble bulb of an unloved vegetable. And so, the world turned, a little crankier in its coffee for a while, but sturdier in its zookeeper-like determination to make sugar behave. In the next gentle drift through time, we'll peek into the velvet-draped salon of high society and discover how sugar didn't only colonize taste buds, it colonized fashion too. The coffeehouse confection conspiracy, under the flicker of candlelight, and amidst the faint scent of ink and parchment, the European Enlightenment was busily enlightening, humming with philosophers, arguments about the soul, and men with impossibly frilled cuffs quoting Latin while spilling tea. And indeed, there was a curious amount of tea spilling, both literal and metaphorical. But nestled in the cozy alcoves of this intellectual explosion was something sweeter, quieter, and, according to dentists, deeply problematic. Yes, it is here, dear listener, that sugar meets coffee and tea, and history takes a swirly turn. Welcome to 17th century London. The streets are vaguely navigable, full of suspicious puddles, loud town criers, and wigs that appear to be hosting small wildlife. If you're anyone with taste, or aspirations of taste, you're probably spending your evenings tucked away in one of the newfangled coffee houses. They had peculiar names like the Turk's Head, the Giddy Goat, or dryly, the Coffee House. Inside, everything smelled of roasted beans, damp coats, and ideas. Brilliant and poorly conceived ideas. Everyone from merchants to poets to unlicensed surgeons could be found arguing over the Ottoman Empire, while sipping a bitter, brooding beverage so intense it could raise the dead, or at least the attention span. At first, these drinks were just that, strong and undiluted, like philosophy or eel pie. But gradually, women and men alike began to procure options. Now enter, stage left, sugar. Imported, expensive, and altogether mysterious, sugar started making cameo appearances in these dark brews. A cube here, a spoon there. You could sweeten your coffee, temper your tea, or, if you were really indulgent, add it to your hot chocolate while pretending small miracles weren't happening on your tongue. The medical experts of the day, whose experience ranged from bloodletting enthusiast to part-time astrologer, were naturally divided. Some claimed sugar was a powerful tonic for melancholy. Others insisted it would rot your liver and summon the plague. Science was very much a coin toss at this point. But one thing was undeniably clear. The sweet stuff made bitter brews far more lovable. And like any great love story, habits formed, expectations brewed. Soon enough, coffee without sugar felt like wearing a corset backwards, technically possible, deeply uncomfortable, and likely to ruin your morning. The coffee house itself evolved with the sweetness. Debates mellowed, tempers cooled. Thinkers began brainstorming less about revolutions and more about dessert trays. One hangs on the edge of sleep theory posits that sugar may have softened radical ideas, not by censorship, but by making philosophers just happy enough to stop trying to overthrow 12 monarchies before lunch. Even in France, the land of meticulous pastries and occasional guillotines, the coffee-sugar partnership became a symbol of modernity and flair. Parisians, eager to emulate the grandeur of the Ottoman court and perhaps distract from their own plumbing situation, embraced sugared drinks with unfiltered enthusiasm. And with this sweet integration came something sneakier. Sugar became invisible. Once an exotic treasure locked away in spice cabinets, sugar began blending in, hiding behind cream, moonlighting in sauces, and giving vague smiles in jams. People stopped seeing it as exotic and started seeing it as necessary, much like trousers. But not everyone was thrilled by this sugary surge. In Venice, a few grizzled spice traders began to worry. If people start putting sugar in everything, they mused over mulled wine, they'll forget about nutmeg, or cloves, or myrrh. Myrrh, by the way, had been having a rough quarter since frankincense left the group to go solo. Still, sugar was not stopped. It was too delightful, too adaptable, and most importantly, it made an absolutely transcendent pairing with caffeine, which, let's be honest, is probably what carried the Enlightenment through its fourth cup of the day. By the dawn of the 18th century, the ratio of thoughtful discourse to sweetened beverages had tipped decidedly in favor of the latter. Political ideologies were drafted with sticky fingers. Epic poems were edited between biscuit crumbs. And somewhere, a man named Thomas was weaving a complex theory of economics while wondering if his cinnamon bun was still warm. So here, in the hushed corridors of candlelit genius, sugar didn't just infiltrate the mind, it flavored it, smoothing out the edges of reason with each granule. The philosophers didn't mind, the poets barely noticed, and the coffeehouse cat, who lived off saucers of clotted cream and unattended scones, was very much in favour. But as sugar's role grew ever more casual, more assumed, more daily, well, let's just say, not everyone was sipping their sweetness willingly. Nestle deeper under your blanket and let your thoughts dissolve like sugar in warm tea, because next we venture to a place where resistance was futile and cravings were colonial. The sweet seduction of tea time. Long before pumpkin spice lattes and oat milk cortados, there was tea, just tea. Simple, quietly steaming, sipped pinky up, or slurped unapologetically, depending on your nation and level of self-awareness. And somewhere along the way, someone, a very clever someone, or perhaps just a drowsy one trying to jazz up their hot leaf water, decided that tea and sugar belong together, like socks and sandals, if that pairing was somehow actually good. Welcome to the peculiar, prim world of 18th century tea time, where sugar met steeping leaves and started a swirling affair that would drape an empire in porcelain, caffeine, and tiny cakes that were mostly ornamental. The British didn't invent tea. That honour, in various forms, likely belongs to the Chinese, who had been steeping pretty much everything for medicinal and leisurely purposes since the mythical Emperor Shennong accidentally boiled a leaf in his water. But what Britain lacked in originality, they made up for in, well, obsessive national dedication to anything they could pour milk into. By the late 1600s, tea had tiptoed into the English upper crust, carrying an air of exotic mystery and an inconvenient price tag. It was rare, it was taxed, it was rumoured to cure everything from melancholy to more melancholy. But then, in a plot twist straight off a botanical romance novel, the addition of sugar changed everything. You see, sugar didn't just sweeten tea, it transformed it into a sensation. Suddenly, sipping tea wasn't just hydration, it was class, it was ritual, it was an experience accentuated by tongs, saucers, and the social contract that prevented one from dunking toast into the cup, even if one dearly wanted to. By the early 1700s, sugar had become a fixture of every fashionable tea table from Bath to Bengal. Sweetening tea was so expected that unsweetened tea became an acceptable sign of mourning or spiritual reckoning. If someone handed you tea with no sugar, Either you had offended them dearly, or they were a radical Quaker. In London, tea houses blossomed like over-caffeinated orchids. These establishments, often frequented by men in cravats and women in structured gowns, provided hot water, social updates, and that most intoxicating luxury, sugared tea. Sugar was still expensive, which is why it was often locked in ornate boxes with tiny silver keys, as though the sugar cube were a rare gem or a secret weapon against ennui. This culinary chemistry between tea and sugar didn't just affect palates. It quietly shifted imports, trades, and the geometry of empire. The East India Company, which was already busy controlling spices, silks, and general nautical mischief, ramped up tea shipments, especially from China. Meanwhile, sugar plantations, staffed by enslaved people across the Caribbean, pushed production to slake Britain's ever-thirstier tea mugs. It's worth pausing here gently to acknowledge that behind every dainty sugar bowl at a Mayfair tea party loomed vast stories of human suffering. Sugar's sweetness came at a price, one paid by enslaved people forced to plant, harvest, boil, and pack it under brutal, back-breaking conditions. The profits from those plantations didn't just buy sugar tongs and jam-filled sponge cakes. They helped bankroll the empire that sipped from saucers while making ledger entries. Still, the British palate grew bolder with its sugar and fussier. There were debates, not quiet debates, but the proper pamphlet publishing, side-eye giving kind, about how many lumps one should add. Was 1 sweet cube refined? Was 2 excessive? Was 3 a declaration of recklessness, or evidence that the tea was in fact terrible? Etiquette manuals sprang up, determining the difference between a tasteful tea habit and a tactical sugar assault. And then came the teapots, hooped and floral, shaped like pumpkins or pineapples. They became the pride of any drawing room. Sugar was proudly on display too, sometimes in elegantly carved silver sugar shakers that looked like miniature rocket ships destined for the planet of dessert. It was in vogue to collect sugar, display sugar, brag about how your sugar came from the finest refining house in Bristol. As the 1700s waned, so too did the innocence of a sugar cube. Smugglers began to trade tea and sugar beyond tax routes. Governments, sensing the thrill of dependency, increased duties. Fortunes were made. Teeth began to rot. And all the while, in townhouses and country estates, cups clinked gently and teaspoons whispered across porcelain, the sleepy echo of sugar's quiet revolution. In the next dream-soft step of our story, we'll drift from these dainty tea trays to something far less civilized, a tale of pirates, shadowy ships, and barrels stuffed with sugar. So settle deeper into your pillow as the sails begin to rise and we trade linens and lace for rum and rogue tides. The great sugar panic of tea times past. Ah, tea time. That glorious 30 minutes of caffeine, quiet judgment, and ceramics. In England, it became more than a warm beverage. It was a ritual, a national identity, and frankly, a group performance requiring hats. But beneath the calm clink of porcelain cups and murmured gossip about Mr. Weatherby's new hedge trimmer, there boiled a much sweeter current: sugar. By the mid-18th century, sugar and tea had entered into what can only be described as a codependent Victorian sitcom. One bitter, one sweet, and both unable to function without the other. But before they were an imperial power couple, their union caused more than a few raised eyebrows and raised blood pressure. Let your head sink into the pillow like a biscuit into a cup of Earl Grey, and drift with me into the streets of Georgian London. The year is 1765. Men wear wigs, women wear hoops larger than modern studio apartments, and suddenly, sugar is everywhere. In your tea, your biscuits, your morning porridge, and, if you're very fashionable, rubbed into your scalp as a dazzlingly ineffective dandruff remedy. The working class, initially priced out of sugar, had begun indulging too. Imported sugar had become cheaper thanks to exploitative colonial labor systems that were absolutely appalling, but also, from a purely economic standpoint, wildly efficient. And because humans make questionable choices in every century, sugar was embraced with open teacups. This was the age of what one contemporary might have whispered as the refinement. To modern ears, it sounds like a Jane Austen film, but in reality, it referred to the process of refining sugar, purifying coarse brown cane into the pristine, shimmering white crystals that Victorian society placed on a pedestal, usually reserved for monarchs and medium-sized dogs. A good housekeeper wouldn't be caught dead serving tea without her silver sugar tongs. Heaven forbid someone should touch the sugar directly. Imagine the scandal. A gloved hand reaching into the bowl. Society was gleefully hooked, but not everyone was pleased. Enter Reverend Jonas Hanway, a man so alarmed by the increase in sugar, he practically fretted himself into the footnotes of history. To Hanway, sipping sweet tea wasn't just a domestic habit. No. It was a moral collapse. He published pamphlets warning that sugar clouded the senses, softened the British spirit, and weakened the thighs of manhood. That's a direct quote. He was very serious about the thighs. Hanway declared tea and sugar a threat to national vigour, comparable only to the French in its sinister subtlety. He argued that women were especially susceptible, replacing honest nourishment, such as a hearty supper with mutton and despair, with fussy trays of sugar-slicked nonsense like treacle tarts or, God forbid, custard. Many dismissed him as a cantankerous fusspot, which, in fairness, he was. But he wasn't entirely wrong. Sugar had slunk into everything. Even medicines, powders, and lozenges were sweetened to ensure compliance. Children, newly emboldened by sugar highs, reached new heights of mischief, like hanging the cat from the bonnet hook or marching the family geese into the parlour in protest of bedtime. In 1790, household sugar consumption among the British population had multiplied nearly tenfold in a century. Sweetness had become synonymous with civility, femininity, and oddly, empire. The more you sweetened your tea, the more imperial your pinky finger. But even amid all the sugar-dusted elegance of tea culture, darker realities loomed like a tarnished silver spoon. The sugar fueling this frenzy came in large part from plantations across the Caribbean and the American South. The wealth of dainty drawing rooms was steeped in exploitation, supported by systems of labor that reduced human lives to profit margins. Still, those seated around their tea trays remained mostly oblivious, or at least selectively so. A good biscuit, like a good empire, often demands a bit of denial. And so, sugar became more than a treat. It was a symbol of refinement, of control, of status. Much baffled foreign diplomats visiting Britain for the first time remarked on how something as small as a sugar cube could command such reverence, and how an empire so vast could be stirred by something so tiny. But soon, the addiction would spread even wider. Beyond the parlour and pantry, into factories and forts, bullets and bakeries, a sticky grip slipping deeper into the gears of capital. As the sugar rush escalated, someone somewhere had a daring idea. What if sugar wasn't just for tea, but for everyone? And not just once a day, but all the time. In the next stretch of our sleepy stroll, we'll find out how sweetness shapeshifted yet again. woven into strange things like medicines, meat, and marketing jingles. But for now, rest easy and let visions of sugar plums, or perhaps slightly judgmental Georgian biscuits, sweeten your drift into dreams. The curious case of the Sugarloaf Mountains that weren't now. If you find yourself drifting through 17th century Europe, as one occasionally does in dreams or unexpectedly demanding trivia rounds, you might stumble across something utterly strange on a merchant's shelf. A tall, menacing cone of hardened sugar called a sugarloaf. It looked suspiciously like a medieval wizard's hat and functioned with all the magical properties of sweetness and probable dental regret. This oddly shaped dessert monument was the pinnacle of sugar's long and slightly sticky journey from cane to kitchen. Before refined granules danced into elegant porcelain bowls, sugar arrived as a hard, conical mass that needed to be shattered with specially designed iron tools called sugar nibs. That's right. Back then, making a cup of tea had a minor blacksmithing requirement. You see, sugar didn't just stroll into people's lives wrapped in neat paper sachets. Oh no. It arrived dramatically, like a diva at the opera, requiring a chisel and possibly a liability waiver. These curious cones, known as sugarloaves, were molded at refineries in places like London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon. Cities that hummed to the quiet rhythms of boiling sugar syrup and men shouting about boiling sugar syrup. Each sugarloaf was a sharp-tipped reminder of how precious and labor-intensive sweetness remained. Produced by pouring concentrated syrup into conical molds, draining them, then drying and shaving them until the cone would stand on its own. The loaves embodied both premium status and exquisite inconvenience. In the hands of a careless cook, sugarloaf shards could threaten molars well into the next epoch. Socially, the sugarloaf was status incarnate. The taller and whiter the cone, the more refined it was, and the more refined it was, the more likely it appeared beside someone with an excess of powdered wigs and a shortage of humility. Displaying a proudly perched sugarloaf in your scullery was essentially the 17th century equivalent of owning a heated towel rack. Extravagant, barely necessary, but deeply enviable. Of course, because humans are nothing if not relentlessly ambitious with things that can be sweetened or weaponized, sugar refining became a full-blown science, particularly in Dutch and British cities. Take London's East End, for example, with its vast refining houses that quietly belched steam and the pungent aroma of burnt syrup into the foggy air. People called them sugar bakeries, though no ovens were involved, and very few cookies. Mostly, it was boiling, draining, scraping, and occasionally being scalded into a career change. Now, as the sugarloaf made its stately appearance in drawing rooms and tea services, a curious subset of the population took on the perilous work of reshaping the stuff. These were the sugar cutters, nimble-fingered professionals with the paradoxical task of breaking sweetness apart. Sugar nippers, like tiny bolt cutters with a flair for baking, were passed down like family heirlooms, or in some cases, hurled across kitchens after a particularly rebellious loaf refused to yield. Children were warned not to nibble at the sugarloaf unsupervised, lest they chip a tooth or impale a sibling. But the real charm of the sugarloaf era lay in ceremony. Using sugar was a theatrical moment. Whether stirring it into mulled wine or shaving it delicately for a guest's tea, the motion carried echoes of the exotic. This was no ordinary ingredient. This was sugar that had sailed from Jamaica or Brazil, passed through fire and funnel, and finally, with great drama, landed in your drawing room, smelling faintly of effort and empire. And, like an elegantly sharp souvenir, sugarloaf gifts were exchanged among the wealthy like mildly dangerous fruitcakes. Holiday occasions came with sweet, cumbersome surprises. Imagine the delight, or panic, of unwrapping 30 pounds of crystallized cone, knowing it would remain a kitchen decoration until someone's birthday or a particularly sugar-dependent emergency. Eventually, as refining technology evolved and people grew weary of the medieval fencing duel, there was every spoonful of sugar, granulated sugar, the airy, pourable marvel we know today, began supplanting the mighty loaf. That didn't happen overnight. Like most revolutions, it began quietly and ended with fewer bruises. Still, for a time, the sugar loaf reigned with tooth-aching majesty, a silent symbol of wealth, taste, and the daily dilemma of whether sweetness was worth the labor of snipping and chipping. Most decided, quite sleepily perhaps, that yes it was. Now, as the scent of sugar-laced history lingers in the air like perfumed steam, let's begin wandering toward a new flavor of intrigue, one that involves sticky fingers, rising markets, and the very curious invention of the sugar cube. A spoonful of molasses and a hint of power. Let's take a slow, syrupy saunter through a peculiar chapter of sugar's hidden empire, the time when molasses quietly helped build a navy, start a rebellion, and perhaps even stain a few wigs sticky during formal dinners. By the mid-1700s, sugar was no longer just a luxurious sweetener hoarded by the upper crust of European society like a toddler with too many jelly beans. It had begun its descent, or ascent, depending on your blood sugar levels, into everyday life. But nestled within the world of sugar was its darker, gooier cousin, molasses. Pop open an imaginary wooden barrel. Take a long, lazy sniff. It smells like burnt toffee and colonial ambition. Molasses was the sticky byproduct of sugar refining. Essentially, it was sugar's sloppy seconds. But what it lacked in glamour, it made up for in utility, especially in the bustling colonies of North America. It was cheaper than raw sugar, easier to store, and most importantly for many colonists, it could be fermented into rum. And not just any rum. Powerful, pirate-defeating, reputation-building, economy-driving rum. Ah yes, rum. Known to inspire sea shanties and poor decisions for centuries. In New England, where winters are cold and Puritan ethics are colder, distilleries began bubbling away with feverish ambition. By the early 18th century, Boston and Rhode Island were practically floating in the stuff. Sugar came in from the Caribbean, molasses got shipped to the distilleries, and rum went everywhere, especially into the hands of ship captains, fur traders, and very confused moose in the Canadian wilderness. Now, molasses wasn't just fermenting in barrels. It began fermenting discontent as well. In 1733, the British Parliament, in what may have been the legislative equivalent of stepping on a Lego in the dark, passed the Molasses Act. This act taxed molasses not from British colonies, which was preferable and thus supposedly cheaper, but from their rivals, like the French and Dutch islands. In theory, this would corral colonial trade loyally back towards Britain. In practice, it created a delightful buffet of smuggling, bribery, and the kind of tax evasion that would give modern accountants night sweats. Colonial merchants became absolute maestros at dodging the Molasses Act. Cargo ships would carry barrels labelled pickled eels or medicinal tar. Dock inspectors were routinely greeted with silver coins, or if needed, a firm suggestion to look the other way and enjoy a quiet lunch break. Molasses, sticky though it was, began lubricating the quiet gears of colonial rebellion. The colonists didn't resent the British Parliament solely because tea was taxed or because some royal personage couldn't name a single town in Connecticut. They were also mad because sugar had become essential. It fueled their economies, tickled their taste buds, and filled up their casks of rum. And now some powdered-wig decision-makers across the ocean were trying to interfere with that. What makes this all delightfully ironic is that much of the molasses stirring these rebellious spirits was being hauled by enslaved labor on Caribbean plantations, a painful truth smoothed over with rum-soaked cheer. The entire cycle, known grimly as the triangular trade, was as bitter as it was sweet. Molasses wasn't just part of colonial fringe life. It was tangled into global trade networks, human suffering, and geopolitical chess games, all while smelling vaguely of gingerbread and sea salt. Yet molasses didn't just twist economies and foment civil unrest. It also had a peculiar knack for overstaying its welcome. One quiet morning in 1919, many years later, and long after imperial rules had been redrawn, a large molasses storage tank burst in Boston's North End, sending a wave of thick brown liquid through the streets. It destroyed buildings, tossed horses, and tragically took lives. Locals still speak of the Great Molasses Flood with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Because when was the last time syrup decided to lay siege to a city block? And that, dear dreamer, is sugar's way. It sneaks into the cracks not just of cookies and teeth, but into the walls of power, into the ledger books of empire builders, and into the occasional street corner, ankle deep and baffling. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine a quiet harbor at night, the moonlight on a docked rum ship, barrels clinking, whispers exchanged over warm molasses fumes. There's something brewing in the air, and not just in the distilleries. We'll sail next into a frostier world, where sugar meets snow, and empires get a craving for confectionery more potent than cannons. The sugar-frosted flour wars of Europe. As the 18th century stretched its wigged and waistcoated limbs, Europe found itself embroiled in a series of disputes that were, at first glance, about trade, tariffs, and colonial possession. But if you peered behind the perfume curtain of diplomacy and powdered politics, you'd find a much sweeter obsession brewing beneath it all: sugar. And not just any sugar, refined sugar, delicate sugar, the kind you could sprinkle on a scone and still see sparkle. The world had gotten a taste, quite literally, and now the craving had to be handled with a bayonet in one hand and a biscuit in the other. In London coffee houses, where intellectuals once discussed philosophy and possibly gout, the latest gossip wasn't about Voltaire or Newton, but about French beet sugar and Dutch refining techniques. Yes, sugar had crept into the veins of Europe like a thief in soft slippers, stealing not jewels, but palates. France, as it so often did, wanted to be at the center of sophistication. But sugar production presented a peculiar problem. Much of the world's cane sugar still coursed in from the Caribbean, particularly from Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, a colony bursting with sweetness and terrible cruelty alike. French aristocrats had grown accustomed to delicate sorbets and spun sugar sculptures, but relied on enslaved labor to make these desserts divinely possible. A spoonful of sugar may have helped the medicine go down, but it also helped the economy look the other way. Meanwhile, Britain, eternally suspicious of anything French unless it was cheese, was heavily investing in its own sugar empire, mainly in Jamaica and Barbados. But rather than simply copy the French, the British took sugar mania in a notably British direction. They industrialized it. Refineries came to London and Bristol, converting raw sugar into white gold that would fill everything from biscuits to political coffers. Entire fortunes were built from frosting. This kick-started what historians gently call an economic rivalry, but you might think of it as a polite sugar brawl, at least as polite as empires can be, while also colonizing large swaths of the planet and inventing weapons with ornate buttons. Sugar tariffs turned into diplomatic chess games with very sticky pieces. In some cases, if you bit into a biscuit in Vienna in 1770, you were, unwittingly, taking a side in a Franco-British trade controversy capable of starting an unpleasant letter or, occasionally, a minor naval scuffle. Naturally, the Dutch, who always seemed to prefer making money quietly, while other nations sang about their empires and got into shouting contests, did quite well for themselves. Dutch sugar refineries in Amsterdam were among the best in Europe, turning syrupy cargo from Java and Suriname into tidy white cubes for the global elite. While the English built factories, the Dutch built profits. Calm, deliberate, cube-shaped profits. And so, sugar found itself at the center of European strategy, not merely as a commodity, but as culture, identity, and quiet battlefield. The menus of the wealthy were refined warfare, chocolate with Spanish sugar, trifle with Caribbean molasses, and the ever-delicate meringue, which demanded only the finest crystals and a complete ignorance of colonial policies. Things took a particularly odd turn when France tried to break Britain's sugary grip by encouraging domestic beet sugar production. Yes, in a kind of culinary nationalism, they decided to farm sugar from underground salad. It worked, in a fashion, but the sugar was earthy, slightly vegetable-esque in its sweetness, a sugar that made you feel vaguely virtuous and slightly disappointed at the same time. Still, wars were fought, treaties were signed, and cakes were decorated. The Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, effectively traded land like so many icing bags at a patisserie. Canada to Britain, Guadeloupe to France, because Guadeloupe, tropical and rich with sugarcane, was considered the sweeter prize. Literally, Britain kept the frost, France kept the frosting. But through all this diplomatic dessert dangling, one curious thing began to happen. Ordinary Europeans, peasants, smiths, even chimney sweeps, began to taste sugar more regularly. It trickled down like molasses on a cold day. And that small sweetness, arriving slowly in teacups and bread loaves, shifted what people expected, what they wanted, and what they craved. So tonight, as you tuck in under your blankets, imagine a Europe crisscrossed with sugar roots, where pastries whispered of power and every cup of tea sipped in silence hinted at global whisperings. Sugar wasn't just a treat. It was a game of empire in edible form. And drifting ahead lies the murky, caramel-colored waters of addiction, advertising, and the mysterious rise of sugar in medicine. Sweet dreams await. The candy-colored empire of Napoleon. As bonnets bobbed through the salons of Europe and powdered wigs were slowly going out of fashion, one cunning emperor decided he didn't just want power or territory. He wanted glucose glory. Yes, alongside his talent for toppling monarchies and briskly marching across maps, Napoleon Bonaparte also had a sweet tooth and an unfortunate sugar problem. You see, when dear Emperor Napoleon found himself neck-deep in geopolitical squabbles with the British, also known as the people who invented tea time, and somehow made it political, he decided to deal them a clever, if slightly saccharine, blow. The year was 1806, and with typical flair, Napoleon declared his continental blockade. No British goods were to enter European ports. That included, most unfortunately, sugar. At the time, all those dainty pastries and jam-slathered breads relied on cane sugar from overseas, specifically from British-controlled Caribbean colonies where sugarcane was grown harvested, and refined with grim efficiency. And if Napoleon couldn't get his trusted spoonful of sweetness, well, no one else on the continent would either. But being a man of both military strategy and dessert ambition, Napoleon looked for alternatives. Someone somewhere had once whispered about sugar beets, a tuberous root that, under the right alchemy of slicing, boiling, and enthusiastic hope, would willingly relinquish its sugary bounty. And oh, how those beets shined in his eyes. Thus began the great French sugar beetification. Napoleon poured money into beet research like a Parisian dowager into pearls. Schools dedicated to the art of beet sugar sprang up across France, with young scholars staring earnestly at root vegetables as if they were about to reveal divine secrets. Chemists refined methods under candlelight, and beets were planted in chilly northern fields that had never seen a palm frond. Louis-Nicolas Vauquelin, a chemist with a moustache that whispered, "I've seen things," helped perfect the technique of extracting sugar from beets. And suddenly, sugar was no longer bound by the transatlantic trade routes. It was now sprouting right in French soil, albeit a bit earthier and less exotic than Caribbean cane. Napoleon was thrilled. Not only had he struck a subtle blow against British commerce, but he now had a homegrown sugar supply, one that would keep his empire buzzed on croissants and confidence. He ordered the construction of beet sugar refineries, handed out medals to beet farmers, and even gave schools extra funding if they taught about how truly noble it was to grow glucose underground. Across Prussia, Bavaria, and parts of Austria, similar revolutions dug their way into the soil. Beet sugar wasn't just a novelty, it became a quiet act of rebellion, a sticky-tongued response to Napoleonic politics. Even after Napoleon himself took his final bow, a dramatic one, involving exile, comeback tours, and a very disappointing finale at Waterloo, the sugar beet remained. And so, by the mid-19th century, Europe had developed not one, but two sweet tooths, one for cane and one for beet. They were chemically identical, yet stubbornly competitive, like twin siblings arguing over whose scone recipe was better. Sugar magnates arose on both sides, steadily wobbling on top of their mounds of molasses money. Ironically, Napoleon's attempt to defy British sugar shaped the very foundation of independent European sugar industries. Though he was eventually defeated by British soldiers and perhaps British dessert smugglers, his earnest vegetable experiment left a sugary aftertaste across the continent. Imagine the scene: French schoolchildren plucking beets from the ground, proudly knowing they were harvesting the empire's sweet salvation. Bakers peering into ovens filled with beet sugar brioche. Entire towns in Germany naming streets after heroic horticulturists, all because one man missed his tea sweetener. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture a beet gently spinning in the darkness. It's not just a root, it's a revolutionary. And beneath its earthen cloak lies history's quietest rebellion, soft, sweet, and surprisingly French. Next, we'll take a delicate detour into the shimmering world of Victorian tea rooms, where sugar cubes became tiny symbols of status, stealth, and scandal. The secret language of teaspoons. In the dreamy quiet of 18th century Georgian parlours, a revolution was steeping in china cups and tinkling gently in porcelain saucers. Sugar, once the rare glitter of spice markets and royal banquets, had tiptoed into middle-class teacups and, quite charmingly, refused to leave. Let's set our slippered feet down in one of those softly candlelit drawing rooms, where a tea table served not only Earl Grey, but also subtle social choreography. For the British in particular, sugar had mingled with tea so deliciously that they were no longer separable. One provided the excuse, the other supplied the flavor, and both became props in a genteel theater of refinement. But it wasn't just what was served, it was how. The teaspoons, you see, had secrets. A woman might stir her tea clockwise to signal interest in a conversation. Counterclockwise. Perhaps she'd heard quite enough, languidly tapping the spoon twice on the rim of the cup. Ah, that subtle gesture meant the tea was too cold, or the gossip too tepid. It gets dreamier. Sugar wasn't just plonked into tea recklessly. No, it was an art form. Sugar tongs, those dainty little metal octopuses, became essential. Offering sugar without tongs, scandalous. Touching the sugar with your fingers, positively prehistoric. The proper use of tongs was considered a reflection of moral fortitude. One must always pinch with purpose. And do you know what influenced how much sugar someone took? Their social temperament. 2 lumps, sociable. 3 lumps, downright exuberant. No sugar at all, suspicious, possibly French. Sugar had become more than sweet. It had become civilized. A proper tea hostess might keep an eye on her sugar bowl like a hawk in lace gloves. Sugar was still expensive enough to be kept under lock and key. That's not a metaphor. It was literally kept in locked silver containers called sugar caddies. If you've ever wondered why the phrase Caddyshack never took off in British high society, there's your answer. Meanwhile, the sugar itself was getting fancier. Refined sugar came in great hard cones known as sugar loaves, which looked distinctly like wizard hats for confectioners. But these weren't the sort of things you casually nibbled on. No, they required a terrifyingly specific tool called sugar nips. Not a nickname for a 1920s jazz band, but more like tiny steel guillotines designed to chip off slivers of sweetness from the sugar cone. Using them without injuring oneself was considered both a practical skill and a form of domestic swordsmanship. Sugar also got theatrical. Some hosts ordered elaborate sugar sculptures made by skilled artisans. A common centerpiece might be a sugar swan, mid-glide, surrounded by candied violets. If such details seem excessive, that's because they were. But that was rather the point. Sugar meant status. Sweetness meant power. Now, while polite society busied itself with symmetrical napkin folding and the virtues of proper lemonade etiquette, the sugar trade was working hard behind the curtains. The tea and sugar habits of British homes were quietly fueling the very empire. Sugar flowed from plantations in the Caribbean, processed under brutal systems, shipped across oceans, and poured discreetly into bone china cups. An entire global economy disguised in a teaspoon stir. And as tea time became a national ritual, somewhere between sacred observance and mid-afternoon coping mechanism, so too did sugar become indispensable. It wasn't just tea, of course. Cakes, puddings, jams, and biscuits all joined in the sweet symphony. Suddenly, children's birthday parties had icing towers, and Queen Victoria's wedding cake was an object of sticky folklore. If you were invited for tea and accepted fewer than 2 spoonfuls of sugar, you might have been regarded as either dangerously modern or suspiciously Presbyterian. Either way, not quite someone to trust with the family parsnip tart recipe. By the end of the 18th century, the British were consuming more sugar than any nation on earth, much of it brewed into their now obsessive tea habits. Afternoon tea had become a kind of social yoga, with less downward dog and more fruit scones. And sugar, the quiet ambusher, sat still and serene on every table, a tiny white mountain of economic consequence pretending to be innocent. So next time you stir your tea with a lazy swirl and feel the granules dissolve with delicate finality, remember, your teaspoon is part of a centuries-old performance. Sugar didn't just sneak in, it waltzed through society with tiny tongs and impeccable manners. And as the kettle begins to whistle once more in our drowsy history, we'll wander toward another cup and another curious place where sweetness met strategy on distant, sun-soaked ships. Candied Empire, when Europe got a sweet tooth. As the 18th century unfurled like a velvet curtain on a slightly overdramatic stage, Europe found itself deep in what we might romantically call a sugar swoon. Nobility nibbled at it, merchants amassed fortunes from it, and doctors, never ones to be left out of a fad, were still trying to decide if sugar was a miracle tonic or a gleaming spoonful of doom. Yes, this was the age when sugar wasn't just a food, it was a fashion statement. Picture Paris salons, brimming with powdered wigs, fluttering fans, and the scent of philosophical rebellion steeping in the corners. Here, amidst the candlelight and the rustle of silk, elite thinkers grappled with such questions as, what is liberty? And should I take a second eclair? Sugar was now everywhere, spun into confections, molded into sculptures, and even used to preserve fruits so they could survive the long journey from summer to Christmas. Not content with merely sprinkling sugar in their tea, Europeans began turning it into shapes. Architectural marvels made entirely out of caramel and marzipan. You could eat a miniature Versailles without even unbuttoning your waistcoat. During high society balls, sugar paste creations were the ultimate small talk. Edible topiary, fountains made of nougat, and once, in Vienna, an entire life-sized infantry regiment constructed from spun sugar, which reportedly collapsed in a mild draught. This was confectionery theatre, equal parts indulgence and engineering, and it revealed just how completely sugar had saturated European imagination. It was delectable, yes, but also deeply symbolic. To lavish sugar upon one's guests meant you had status, access to the global trade web, and very good dental insurance, or no teeth at all, which in certain circles was simply considered chic. Behind all this sweetness, of course, loomed the still shadowy machinery of sugar production, the Caribbean plantations, the enslaved labor, the triangular trade networks that stitched together suffering, sweetness, and staggering profit. But in the parlors of London and the cafes of Naples, such realities were often kept in the pantry, far from the dining room. And speaking of London, dear, foggy, cricket-loving London, it also had its own sugar transformation. The bustling city saw a rise not only in sugar imports, but also in sugar houses. Curious, soot-blackened buildings where raw sugar would be boiled, clarified, molded, and refined. A job that, let's just say, did not come with air conditioning. The sugar house workers, many of them German immigrants, sweated away in near-boiling rooms, coated in a fine dusting of sweetness that probably resembled living inside a gingerbread inferno. They handled copper kettles, bone char filters, and worked with a devotion normally reserved for religious zealots or particularly ambitious bakers. This was industrial-scale alchemy, turning sticky beige sludge into sparkling white crystals like magic, if magic ran on boiling point charts. Meanwhile, sugar's culinary repertoire blossomed. Cookbooks began including more elaborate sweets. Ugly puddings were out, clever jellies were in. The boiled sweet, the humble ancestor of the modern hard candy, made its first sticky appearance. Sugar allowed for dazzling culinary creativity, especially among chefs to royalty, who endured tremendous pressure to out-sugar each other. There exists a delightful record of an 18th century banquet in which the dessert table featured a sugar model of Mount Vesuvius, complete with erupting sugar lava and biscuit Pompeians. It was lauded as a triumph by guests, at least until it collapsed onto a passing duchess, whose powdered wig absorbed most of the damage. And yet, with all this excess, sugar was also becoming quietly democratic. The price began to fall. What was once exclusive to kings and clergy was trickling gently into the teacups of clerks, cobblers, and cantankerous aunts. Tea and sugar became a pair, like socks and sandals, but less controversial. And once you sweeten your tea, there really is no going back. It's not unlike giving a cat its first taste of roast chicken. Luxury had become habit, and in doing so, sugar had done something tremendous. It had changed not just what people consumed, but how they conceived of comfort, pleasure, and even identity. It was no longer exotic, it was daily, invisible, essential, which, incidentally, is how most of history changes the world. And if you think sugar's wild European ride ends here, well, you'd better rest your spoon, because soon political revolutions would start stirring the cup a bit more aggressively. And sugar was about to get tangled in revolution, rebellion, and the most delicious tax drama ever to hit the high seas. The teacups of empire. London, in the mid-1800s, was not always the grey and dignified puddle it is today. Back then, it was a jittery, sugar-crusted machine, politely running on two things: imperialism and tea. Both, it turned out, were soaked in sweetness. In fact, if you listened closely in Victorian drawing rooms, you could practically hear teacups shivering with excitement. 3 lumps, please, and don't skimp. But this chapter doesn't begin in England, precisely. It begins where many things unwanted by polite society tend to begin, quietly, in the background, where the sugar boils and the money whispers. By the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, sugar had become not merely a treat, but a demand. Small acts of daily gentility, high tea, afternoon tea, the suspiciously unnecessary pre-bedtime tea, all needed sugar. And that sugar had to come from somewhere. Or, in most cases, somewhere else. The British Empire, always eager to stir its spoon into other people's teacups, perfected the habit of growing sugar far away and profiting handsomely at home. From Jamaica to India, from Mauritius to Guyana, the sun never set on a field of sugarcane, and neither did the exhaustingly long shipping paperwork. Take India, for one bittersweet example. Sugar had lived in India for centuries, of course. Indian farmers knew its moods well, but under British rule, the sugar industry was pressed and reshaped to benefit not the land, but the empire's insatiably sweet appetite. The East India Company, a deeply shady, deeply tea-obsessed organization with the moral compass of a raccoon in a jewelry store, discovered that one could dominate both the supply of tea and the sugar that flavored it, as long as one didn't ask too many ethical questions. And yet, even at the height of colonial expansion, the British palate needed convincing. As odd as it sounds, sugar was still thought of with gentle suspicion by some circles, especially the ones who had no idea how commerce worked but had very strong opinions over crumpets. So began the cultural campaign. Sugar became synonymous with softness, femininity, and civilization. It was added to recipes, hinted at in poetry, and liberally sprinkled over the baked goods of the well-to-do. A dainty sugar cube wasn't just a sweetener, it was a lifestyle flex. It helped, of course, that sugar disguised all manner of Victorian culinary crimes. British cuisine back then was less about finesse and more about boiling until opinions no longer matter. Sugar offered flavour in a way that boiled mutton rarely could. Suddenly, desserts became status symbols. Trifles constructed like edible cathedrals, biscuits stacked like tiny colonial monuments, and puddings dense enough to double as doorstops. The kitchen, once the smoky domain of pies and game, became a palace of confections. The British cookbooks of the era read like love letters to glucose, featuring such charming monstrosities as gelatinous blancmange and spotted dick. Sweet sauces were ladled over previously savoury dishes without so much as a warning. Even the vegetables could be glazed in sugar, as if apologising for being green and vaguely healthy. Sugar had done it. It had slinked its way into tradition, etiquette, and empire. Under the clink of porcelain. No longer the exotic luxury it once was, it was now common, expected, invisible almost, but always there in spoonfuls and policies. But sweetness had its shadows. The vast sugar supply chain required labour, backbreaking, soul-chewing, often coercive labour. While slavery had been abolished in many parts of the British Empire by the 1830s, the plantations didn't exactly become workers' paradises overnight. New systems took its place. Indentured, labourers from India and China were shipped across oceans, their contracts written in confounding colonial legalese too complex for sleep, and yet far too dull for the daylight. Many of these labourers ended up on sugar plantations. They brought with them songs, sorrow, and the occasional recipe. Over generations, cultures mixed in the cane fields. Languages blended, cuisines shifted, and from terrible conditions emerged new traditions. Not silver linings exactly, but small, persistent lights in the sugar gloom. So while the empire sat on upholstered chairs, sipping civility from china-rimmed cups, the world shifted around them. Sugar was no longer just a flavour, just a currency, or just a colonizer's prize. It was something more tangled and human, complex as the people who harvested it, sold it, sweetened it, and sometimes simply stirred it, absent-mindedly, into tea while staring out a window and wondering how it all came to this. But to truly understand how sugar seeped beyond economics and into the very veins of power and policy, we'll have to shift our gaze to the bureaucrats, the tariffs, and the absurd debates that made sugar a diplomatic substance. Let's gently turn the page, or snooze along, as we drift into the sugary world of global politics dressed up as dessert. Polite colonizers and the sugar that pretended to be tea. Somewhere between the rattling teacups of Georgian England and the clinking silver spoons of Louis XVII's France, sugar did something quietly genius. It put on a monocle and strolled right into the drawing room, pretending to be tea's tiny polite friend. It's true. By the 18th century, sugar had moved out of the grimy kitchens of apothecaries and bakers and nestled into genteel living rooms all across Europe. It had dressed itself in lace doilies, taken etiquette classes, and begun daintily dissolving into every cup of hot brown liquid it could find. Sugar wasn't just a sweetener. It was now part of a well-mannered ritual, like a social climber with a powdered wig. British high society became positively smitten with this ritual called afternoon tea, a genteel gymnastics of sipping, gossiping, and pretending not to notice that the Earl of Somewhere just dropped a scone in his lap. And there, right at the heart of this ceremony, was sugar. Lump or loose, white or brown, tantalizing in tiny silver tongs. Now, to the observer watching from the corner of the parlour, perhaps the family cat or a suitably bored footman, this might have looked like domestic tranquility with matching china. But make no mistake, sugar was running the show. Few noticed that all this refinery was underwritten by, well, refineries. gigantic sugar plantations sprawled across the Caribbean, worked by enslaved people stolen from Africa. But the drawing rooms of London didn't talk about that. Not over tea. No. They talked about India's monsoon weather, or the Duchess's sixth engagement, or the really quite remarkable floral pattern on the Wedgwood saucers. In this oddly prim world, sugar took on the role of polite necessity. It wasn't questioned, it simply was. Like gravity, or the alarming number of cousins everyone seemed to have. Among upper-class Victorians, to serve tea without sugar would have been like offering a violin without strings. The scandal, the audacity. What's next? Toast without marmalade. The events looping around this newfound addiction to sweetness weren't quite so composed. As sugar demand skyrocketed in Europe, the Caribbean islands became imperial chew toys. Everyone wanted a bite. Britain, France, the Dutch, even the Danes, all squabbled and swapped islands like particularly aggressive collectors of real estate marinated in molasses. When France traded Canada to Britain in the 1763 Treaty of Paris, it chose to keep Guadeloupe, a small island, yes, but one positively dripping with sugar profits. If anything sums up the 18th century global priorities more than choosing sweet crystals over snow-covered forest, I have not found it. Meanwhile, as refined sugar danced elegantly in porcelain cups, its production remained anything but refined. Enslaved workers on sugar estates usually toiled 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, under harsh tropical suns and even harsher overseers. Mortality rates were so high on sugar plantations that planters calculated human lives like they did barrels of rum, by the shipload. But in Europe, those grim numbers converted themselves, by some strange alchemy of distance and convenience, into pleasant sweetness, tea cakes, and delirious recipes involving apricot preserves. Ironically, sugar also made its way into the homes of the less posh. As trade expanded and cost went down, well, not for the labourers, sugar trickled its way into markets and shops where cobblers and chimney sweeps might buy it by the spoon. It was expensive, but not impossible. Even working-class families might splurge on sugar cubes to impress guests or bake something festive during holidays. A kind of democratic sprinkle, though one born of empire. By the late 1700s, sugar was no longer a rare indulgence. It was turning into a daily habit, one lump or two. You see, we were already addicted. We just happened to be wearing gloves while it happened. Back in those tidy drawing rooms, sugar was a social lubricant. Not the oily kind, but the kind that sweetened a conversation, softened a dispute, flavoured a scandal. And yet the sugar bowl, so unassuming, so refined, never once cleared its throat and reminded anyone about the thousands of lives that had sweetened its contents. But history, as it often does, began to stir, and in the flickering candlelight of conscience and commerce, a quiet ripple began, one that would challenge sugar's moral invisibility and plant the seeds of something unexpected. Let's drift there next, into the world of whispers, quills, and abolitionist tea parties, the quiet empire of the sugar cube. By now, sugar had pulled off a rather remarkable trick, installing itself not merely as a pantry staple, but as a silent architect of power and preference. And not in the grand, roaring kind of way that spices or gold wage their campaigns. No, sugar preferred a quieter creep, like ivy over stone, or a cat that somehow owns your home without paying rent. By the dawn of the 19th century, this once precious crystal, once locked away in apothecaries and aristocratic desserts, had infiltrated almost every kitchen in Europe and the New World. But before you start picturing hopeful bakers with powdered wigs and raspberry tarts, we must travel dreamily into the era of the sugar cube. Ah yes, the sugar cube. A geometric miracle, a tiny saccharine sculpture, an object so charmingly petty that it's hard to believe wars and empires hovered delicately above its clinking presence in porcelain teacups. But first came the problem. Sugar, by the late 1700s, was still mostly sold in massive rock-hard cones known as sugar loaves. These loaves were more like medieval boss monsters, firm, foreboding, and requiring an iron tool called sugar nips to break them apart. Guests at tea were, understandably, rarely inspired while watching their host wrestle a sugar loaf as if preparing for some dangerous ritual. Enter the humble cube. The credit for its invention often lands at the feet of Jakub Krzysztof Rad, a Moravian man living in what is now the Czech Republic, a confectionery manager, a sugar savant, and above all, a husband. Legend whispers that Rad's wife, Juliana, accidentally injured herself trying to slice sugar from a particularly unyielding loaf. Blood, bandages, and cursing may have been involved. Moved by love, and perhaps by a desire to limit future domestic sugar wounds, Rad went to work. In 1843, he patented a method for pressing moistened sugar into even, tidy little bricks. They were stackable, transportable, and most importantly, incapable of maiming dinner guests. Sugar had entered the realm of convenience. It had gone modern. But the sugar cube story wasn't just about safety and aesthetics. It was a portal to subtle expansions. Tea shops lined their tables with neat little sugar piles. Cafes offered cubes to stir into thick, bitter coffees, and households rejoiced at not having to wage a nightly battle against the great loaf. This shift, however tiny, echoed something larger. That sugar was now so thoroughly embedded in life, people didn't think twice about adding it to everything. Sweet had stopped being a rare lick of luxury. It had become the norm. Sugar was no longer a guest. It ran the place. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American ingenuity was hard at work, inventing newer and greater excuses to deploy sugar. Marshmallows had started evolving from sticky root confections into puffed wonders. Candy makers, often peculiar people with too much time and too many copper pots, created everything from striped peppermints to jelly beans that mimicked fruits with uncanny accuracy. Imagine the first confused customer biting into what looked like a perfect grape, but tasted suspiciously like bubble gum, regret, and a dentist's mortgage payment. Cubes eventually became cubes within cubes. Sugar not just as substance, but as experience. There was the cube stirring ceremony, the clink against the teacup rim, the contemplative dissolve. It became ritual, performance, social lubricant. The sugar cube, small as it was, taught us to expect our bitterness softened and our coffee never quite awake without it. Underneath this dainty transformation, entire industries churned away. Beet sugar, having quietly tiptoed into prominence during Napoleon's continental blockade, was gaining ground against its rival cane. Technology grew quicker, refining grew more precise. The sources diversified, but all roads still led to sweetness. In the drawing rooms of Paris, cubes were passed with tongs and polite smiles. In the saloons of New York, they were dunked in bitters and whiskey, starting the long, inebriated waltz of the old-fashioned. In factories, they were wrapped, stacked, and shipped, whispering to the world, "We're here now, we're easy, and we're not going anywhere." As the sugar cube quietly occupied space in rituals both sacred and mundane, its charms, like sugar itself, were hard to resist. That discreet plop into a teacup didn't just sweeten the taste. It sweetened the expectation of comfort, of stability, of modern life running on little unspoken indulgences. And with cubes secured in saucers and hearts across continents, sugar turned its attention, ever so gently, to somewhere entirely new. A hush now, dear listener, as our sleepy spiral leads us next into the glittering frosted rise of a kitchen that would become an altar. One frosted cake at a time, sweetener diplomacy and the great cola wars. When sugar stopped being just a food and started being a quietly grinning diplomat, things got fizzy. By the 20th century, sugar had already conquered continents more effectively than most emperors. But then it did something truly audacious. It made itself essential to international relations. And not in a boring United Nations kind of way, no. More like in the friendly, tooth-rotting handshake between rival cola companies, Cold War powers, and households desperately trying to keep children from bouncing off the ceiling. Now, to understand sugar's role in modern geopolitics, we must waft slowly into the post-war era, where bomb shelters were a trendy backyard accessory and low-fat, hadn't yet declared war on flavor. America, comfortably victorious, found itself entering a golden age of television, malt shops, and unchecked dessert enthusiasm. Enter the rise of Coca-Cola and Pepsi, two bubbly generals in the Cold War of beverages. On the surface, they seemed like innocent rivals. Beneath, they were fierce symbols of capitalism and Western ship-shape consumption. But what made them irresistible? Sugar. And branding, yes, but mostly sugar. Glug after glug of syrupy cheer, bottled and carbonated patriotism. Coca-Cola in particular took its sweetness on tour. It followed American GIs into wars and peacetime negotiations, as if to say, "Sorry about the airstrikes. Would you like a refreshing drink?" In Vietnam, Coke was stocked on military bases before treaties were. Stalin banned it, calling it an imperialist elixir. Meanwhile, US soldiers stationed abroad flooded foreign shores with red cans, a sugary invasion without a single boot laced. In one practically bedtime-worthy moment of sugar diplomacy, Marshal Georgy Zhukov of the Soviet Union reportedly developed a soft spot for Coca-Cola after World War II. But to request it openly, political suicide. So a white, label-less version was allegedly whipped up just for him, Coke in disguise, like a sweet spy wearing a trench coat. Think about that. A sugar drink so iconic, it had to enter enemy territory wearing a fake mustache and pretending to be champagne. By the 1970s, sugar had undergone yet another transformation in the mighty hands of marketing sorcery. It was no longer just in your drink. It was in your cereal, your bread, your salad dressing, and somewhere along the line, probably your toothpaste. Health food started to mean granola bars that were, surprisingly, just compressed cookies in hiking boots. And while parents debated whether to ban chewing gum or allow just one scoop of ice cream, sugar slid quietly into processed foods like a cat tiptoeing into a sunbeam. Now, a moment of sleepy speculation. Imagine a high-stress United Nations meeting where nothing gets resolved until someone wheels in a cart of chilled root beer floats. The ambassadors sigh, spoon frothy clouds into their mouths, and murmur, "Yes, perhaps peace is possible." A whimsical daydream, perhaps, but sugar's real mediation powers weren't far off. Sweet treats became tools of diplomacy. Treat your guests, and they'll smile through delicate negotiations, though they may crash in 30 minutes and forget the trade clauses. Even in outer space, sugar hitched a ride. During the space race, American astronauts snacked on Tang, a yellow, citrus-flavored powder invented by scientists but made beloved by its sugar content. Advertised as the drink of astronauts, Tang rocketed from chem lab obscurity to kitchen table stardom, turning breakfasts into launch pads. Somewhere, an orange planet in the Tang galaxy quietly thanked sugar for its interstellar passport. But not all was effortless clinking of dessert spoons. As developing countries began producing more sugar than they consumed, prices danced uneasily on the global stage. Entire economies buckled under the weight of molasses politics. Some nations began planting sugarcane not for food or export, but to qualify for protective tariffs and subsidies. Colonial plantations may have faded, but their echoes whispered in every warehouse receipt and anxious trade ambassador's teacup. And naturally, the artificial rivals arrived. High fructose corn syrup swaggered in during the 1970s, proclaiming itself cheaper, sweeter, and patriotic. Made right at home in Midwestern fields, it began quietly replacing cane sugar in sodas, pastries, and just about anything that wasn't nailed down. But even this shift couldn't unseat sugar from its weathered throne. Everyone knew who the true original sweet sovereign was. And so, sugar's empire, once carved out of nightmare fields and imperial conquests, now wore a deceptively charming grin. Laced into diplomacy, bubbled into soft drinks, wrapped in neon labels on supermarket shelves across the globe. As our eyes gently drift toward dreams, sugar too begins to take its rest, momentarily content in its quiet conquest. But in the stillness ahead, there's one chapter left, the soft, sleepy epilogue of sugar's saga. Let's float there next to see where all of this sweetness eventually settles. A sweet goodbye beneath the moon. As twilight spills its silvery ink over the sugarcane plains of history, we arrive at our final stop, not with a bang or a cane crack, but with a soft sigh, like the rustle of wind through the sugar leaves at dusk. Sugar, that sneaky little substance with the personality of a Victorian gossip, always in someone's tea, meddling quietly in affairs it wasn't exactly invited to, has done more than sweeten our pastries. It's built empires, funded revolutions, wooed entire economies, and occasionally caused a dental uprising or two. By now, the deceptively innocent sugar cube has conquered not only your coffee mug, but the entire world map. Its story isn't only written in cookbooks and recipe scrolls. It's etched in blood and coin and craving. We've seen it spark treaties and tantrums, poetic odes and toothless whispers. And as the modern world hummed into the 20th century on gears and electricity, sugar pivoted again, no longer only in bulk trades and colonial ships, but dancing into our processed lives like a showgirl with a saccharine smile. The birth of modern advertising merged with sugar in a blaze of neon. Cereal that crackled like static. Soda sizzled with slogans. Candy bars wrapped themselves like little edible promises of joy. Behind the glossy sweetness, scientists started scratching their chins, twisting hormonal pathways, tickling dopamine, and cavorting with metabolic mischief. Sugar had a peculiar way of throwing internal parties that left the body feeling somewhat ransacked in the morning. Governments began to fret. Nutrition labels started to sprout up, like leaves on an embarrassed tree. Studies emerged, whispering secrets about the link between sugar and all manner of modern malaise, from sluggish livers to nations nodding off with afternoon slumps. Yet, in a charming twist of irony, even as people warned about the dangers of sugar, they marketed the warnings with sugar-coated graphics and soft-lid infographics framed by cupcakes. Doctors and dietitians held workshops beside tables of donuts, and health campaigns handed out fruit juices with enough sugar to start a small bonfire. But sugar, ever the shrewd socialite of substances, didn't vanish. It simply changed clothes. It became elusive, fashionable, traded names, sucrose, fructose, maltodextrin, aliases like debutantes at a masquerade. It slunk into salad dressings, kissed the rims of nutrition bars, and curtsied politely through every aisle of the snack world. It even dipped its toes into politics. Trade laws, subsidies, tariffs. There were passionate debates, secret deals in fluorescent-lit committee rooms over just how much corn syrup should dance in your ketchup. No one could quite agree, and sugar didn't mind. It sat quietly in the room, grinning behind its crystalline facade. Yet, through all this, humanity never quite broke up with it. From grandmas slipping spoonfuls into tea to toddlers in cupcake-fueled euphoria, we remained, rather hopelessly, enchanted by this golden sweet thread that had sewn itself into our history. And perhaps that's the real magic, not the economic empires, not the naval routes or union strikes or political squabbles, but the quiet moment a child watches sugar dissolve in water as if it were a spell, the way cookies muffle the deepest sorrow, the low hum of a kitchen lined with powdered sugar where time slows and love smells like cinnamon and syrup. Historians often call sugar a commodity, but really, it's a diary, a syrup-smeared record of who we were, and sweetly, absurdly, who we still are. Tonight, as streetlights flicker like fireflies, and cupboards hum with forgotten candies and the half-eaten jars of jam, sugar continues its quiet reign, not by force, but by invitation. Every spoonful, a little treaty. So now, with your head nestled gently against your pillow, and the air still as a sugarcane field, before dawn, let's rest. No more battles or beetroot wars, no more molasses mutinies or marzipan politics. Just hush, and let the last granules settle around the soul like snowfall made of caramel dust. Sleep now. History can wait.